You're listening to Exploring Boys Education, a regular podcast produced by IBSC that examines current issues affecting boys, teachers of boys, and boys' schools. I'm Bruce Collins, Director of Membership Engagement at IBSC, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to another episode. Before we dive into today's critical discussion, I want to highlight a few upcoming opportunities designed to support your professional growth and your school's development. Join our Boys in Gaming virtual event on March 23rd to explore the digital landscape boys inhabit. From April 13th to May 3rd, we have the Resilient Boy online class with Andrew Reiner, and registration is open for that. Starting soon, we have various IBSC Ideas Labs, and these are a great way to connect with global peers in small focus groups. We have 2 in-person events coming up. The first of those is the IBSC Australasian Regional Conference, which will be hosted by Prince Alfred College and St. Peter's College in Adelaide, South Australia. And this conference takes place from May 3rd to 5th. Then, very exciting, from June 29th to July 2nd this year, we look forward to seeing many of you at the 2026 IBSC Annual Conference at St. Stithians College in Johannesburg, South Africa. For more details on these programs, please consult our newly published quarterly newsletter, Compass, or visit our website at www.theibsc.org. Joining us on this episode is Evan Harris, an expert on emerging AI risks in schools. Evan is the president of the Pathos Group and has a distinguishable background as a former teacher and administrator. He served as a technology ethics fellow at Stanford's Human-Centered AI Institute and co-authored the legal guide on deepfake sexual abuse for the National Association of Independent Schools in the US. Most recently, he developed the first national deepfake safety course for students, and it's a real honor to have one of the leading voices in digital safety here to guide us through this complex topic. And so today we are tackling deepfakes, which is a topic that is moving faster than many of us can track. Put simply, deepfakes are synthetic media, images, videos, or audio created using artificial intelligence to convincingly replace one person's likeness with another. While we often think of this in terms of Hollywood special effects, the technology has reached a point where it is easily accessible to students, and it often leads to significant harm. In my conversation with Evan, we move beyond the headlines to look at the broader cultural shift occurring in our schools. We discuss the elephant in the room, which is the alarming statistic that while 90% of victims are female, 90% of perpetrators are boys. But Evan also sheds light on why boys are increasingly being targeted themselves. And most importantly, we talk about a practical order of operations for school leaders to move from being overwhelmed to being prepared. Well, Evan, it's lovely to have you on the podcast with us today. Welcome to Exploring Boys Education.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Evan, I'm also grateful to Janet Lien, an IBSC colleague at the Browning School. I know you've spent some time with their leadership talking about exactly what we're going to be talking about on this podcast. I know the work you did with them was really, really appreciated. Why don't we start there? Looking through the educator's lens, we see lots of headlines about deepfakes and the impact they're having on young folk and for our audience, particularly for boys. If you had to go beyond those headlines and think about school leaders, educators in schools, what do they need to understand about the current deepfake landscape? Is there a broader cultural shift that's happening in the way boys interact with reality?
Sure. So it's funny you mentioned headlines. I'm talking next week with a reporter from Wired magazine, and I think the original lens that he had on his story was solely focused on deepfake sexual abuse, which has sort of dominated headlines in terms of how deepfakes are affecting schools, and for good reason. And we can get into sort of what that incident pattern looks like, how the laws have changed, its effect on victims, what schools need to be thinking about. But unfortunately, and this is part of what I told that reporter, the threat landscape is a lot larger than that. We're thinking about reputational attacks, a new vector for sort of cyber attacks against the school, either looking to exfiltrate data or steal money. We're thinking about disruptions to the school's marketing efforts, right? What does it mean to post photos and videos of children in a world where those photos could be used to abuse or locate or identify those children? And so, this is not just deepfake sexual abuse. It's also sort of a new form of bullying. I think, unfortunately, we're going to see more agentic AI. So people using AIs to sort of autonomously or semi-autonomously attack others, write posts about other people, attack the school's infrastructure. So it's really just this kind of expanding set of ideas. And so that's a lot for schools to grapple with all at once, especially given that schools have so much on their plates already. And so part of what I try to do with schools is say, okay, we're going to sort of educate you on what this looks like, but then we're really just thinking about this through the lens of your policies, your crisis readiness, and your preventative efforts. Sort of how do you educate different stakeholder groups? What is the order of operations? What does each stakeholder group need to know? With what tone do we speak to each group? What are their priorities? What role do they play in this? Because it's different for teachers, parents, and kids. And then even within kids, it's different for high school kids and middle school kids. But I have found that just approaching through policy, crisis readiness, and prevention simplifies what I think otherwise would be almost just too complicated to even try to approach.
I'm looking forward to getting to that operational readiness near the end of our conversation, because I think that's so important. That's, what folk can take away from this conversation. But I'd also like to look at boys and harassment. As you alluded to, deepfakes are often discussed in the context of female victims, and very rightly so. But I know we're seeing a rise in boys being targeted. And so how does this impact of deepfake abuse manifest differently in boys, and how should schools adjust their support systems to kind of meet this reality that's happening these days?
Yeah, this is such an important point. So kind of elephant in the room, the best indications we have right now are that about 90% of the victims of deepfake sexual abuse in the United States are female. About 90% of the perpetrators are boys. However, I think when boys are targeted, and this is actually something we see in sort of regular sexual abuse as well, they often have a harder time disclosing what has happened to them. The number one feeling that I hear from kids that have experienced this, both male and female, is an overwhelming sense of shame. Even though obviously they've done nothing wrong, they feel like they want to hide from the world. They worry that people will think that the images are real, that they won't be able to take them down, and they don't know who to talk to. Even in those cases where they may have a very good relationship with their parent or with their teacher, they're not sure who to turn to. And so it's one of the reasons it's so important to educate on this, is that if we don't educate kids about this, they won't know that there are systems and laws that are there to protect them, that they're the victim of a crime, that they can get these images taken down. And so to your question about how do we kind of adjust for boys, I think it becomes doubly important that we get boys to reflect on this question of who is your trusted adult, both at home and at school. Who is that person? I know some schools will even have them write down that name. There's one school I was just at in Pennsylvania where they do this exercise 3 times a year. That's that important. But I think making sure that every single child in the school knows who that person is, that they've thought through this, and making sure that parents are there to play their role and that they're not caught off guard, that they know what deepfakes are, why it's not a prank or a joke, but very serious, so they can play that deterrence role. But that they're also ready to play their role if the child is abused. They know how to handle it emotionally and sort of more procedurally. What do we do next?
Yeah, I love what you're saying about schools being intentional about boys having someone to go to. If schools are intentional about creating those safe spaces where boys can be brave and courageous about sharing what's happening to them in the school environment, that's a good start.
Yeah. I mean, it's correlated with self-harm. I think sometimes as adults of a certain generation, we tend to think of like online harms and then sort of in-person physical harms as these two separate worlds. But for kids who are living through this, that's a very kind of antiquated concept. These worlds are blurred much more than they are maybe for older people. And yeah, like this, like being a victim of this is correlated with self-harm. And the other interesting thing, if someone is victimized by deepfake sexual abuse or image-based abuse of any kind, it's correlated with in-person abuse. And so part of what a school should be thinking about if a child is victimized by this is, number one, just because it's the first time we're catching it doesn't mean it's the first time it's happened. And number two, Just because it's this kind of online digital form of harassment and abuse doesn't mean that it's the only form of abuse that this child is suffering. Maybe there's something else happening here in person. And so I think we have to reframe as adults a bit about how we're thinking about this online versus offline thing, because we've seen this now as a trend for years where schools are thinking like, well, what happens off campus? To what degree is that really our responsibility? I mean, the truth is, if you're, a school, you're a mandatory reporter. And so this is like any other type of sexual abuse. And if it impacts what's happening on school and that child is not able to learn because they don't feel safe or they have to sit in class with someone that's abusing them, you're not fulfilling your mission or your obligation to that child. And so this is just not two separate worlds.
It's funny you talk about adults, because I think many of us as adults work with tech a lot and are tech savvy, but there are many who maybe aren't. And I think with the AI world becoming more sophisticated, it's getting harder and harder to tell what is real or what is not. I wonder, in your experience of that, how can schools teach boys the practical skills of discernment, of developing an internal filter to help them identify those red flags and develop a healthy skepticism for what is real and what is not in the media that they consume?
So here's what's so interesting about exactly that, because I showed a video yesterday. It's a cat knocking over a vase, and then the cat runs away and the human comes in the room and blames the dog. And it's the dog, sort of, saying, oh, it wasn't me. You know how dogs do. And I showed this to an auditorium of like 500 middle schoolers. They knew basically immediately that this was AI. I've done a test too where I show two clips. One of them's real, one of them's fake. When I show it to adults, it's 50-50. Like they truly don't know, because the newest deepfakes, especially for things like sort of online marketing and stuff, where it's someone holding up a product they're using, where there's a lot of profit incentive to get these hyper realistic influencers. They've gotten extremely good. When I do that with adults, it's 50-50. When I did it with upper school kids, 100% of them got it right. I mean, virtually 100%. And then when I ran it with middle schoolers yesterday, it was 5th through 8th. I was curious. I was like, well, this will be interesting. They're a little younger. Some of them are maybe less on social media, but they still have YouTube. What will their response be? 100% got it right. So that comes with some false sense of confidence that you're going to be able to continue to be able to discern, because the line is blurring. It's disappearing in front of our eyes, the line between real and fake. But to your point about kind of the digital media literacy piece, when we're entering into a world where just noticing little artifacts and patterns of what identifies a deepfake, when that starts to slip away from us because the deepfakes have gotten so good, the emphasis has to fall on kind of the psychology of how deepfakes affect the brain. So it's, wow, this got me in this really emotional place. When we see something emotional, we're more likely to believe it and more likely to share it. That's true, interestingly, not just for negative emotions like fear and anger, but also for excitement and happiness. A cute cat is just as likely to kind of light up the brain as something scary. It's appeal to authority. It's confirmation bias. It's all these things that kind of short circuit our critical thinking. And in some cases, like scams, get us to act in ways that are not in our own self-interest. And so understanding those red flags is really, really important to protect ourselves as consumers, as citizens in a democracy, as community members in a school. They have to have all that kind of literacy. And then for adults, that's important too. But what I would add is kind of like digital provenance. Where did this image come from? Can we get into the metadata? Who posted it? What's their possible motivation? And thinking through that side of it as well, which kind of gets a bit more technical. It's a bit more sort of digital forensics, but it's the combination of those two things that is what's going to be the focus going forward, because it won't be taking out a magnifying glass and finding little mistakes in the video. Those are disappearing.
And I suppose for boys, the whole concept of teaching them digital literacy or becoming good digital citizens doesn't really change. The message doesn't change. Whether it's a fake or a real image, if it's out there to harm, that's something that they need to have that filter for, in terms of filtering that out rather than taking it on.
That's right. A quick line I use all the time is, just because the image is fake doesn't mean your impact isn't real. I wanted to sort of put a flag down on that, because that's a common misconception. This stuff gets marketed to them like it's a prank or a joke very often.
Evan, I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, that the trend is still, we spoke earlier about about boys starting to be victimized in this space. But I think the elephant in the room, which we can't ignore, is that stat that you gave earlier, that 90% of victims of deepfakes are girls and 90% of creators are boys. And so given that boys are frequently the primary creators of this content, I wonder how schools can move away or beyond scare tactics to empower students to make really good ethical decisions and truly grasp the long-term consequences of their digital actions.
Yes. So this is huge. I think some of it comes down to just like executive functioning, right? It's taking time to reflect metacognitively about what this would do to another person. I mean, I asked in that assembly yesterday, like, imagine coming to school and having images or videos of you saying something you didn't say or doing something you didn't do circulating. Imagine what that would feel like, just giving them a moment to pause. Because anyone who's worked in schools, we know that so often it's just impulse control stuff. They don't think through the impact of what they're really doing. And in the case of some of this deepfake sexual abuse, they don't understand that what they're doing could be a felony. They could go to jail. This is not a prank or a joke. And so there's some deterrence there. And I don't want it to just be sort of scare tactics for scare tactics' sake, but they have to know that this is not, like I said, a prank or a joke. What's going on under the hood here, I'm still kind of trying to work out. But I do think that the uptick in the youth-to-youth sex abuse category that we've seen in the U.S., it's doubled in the last 10 years in schools, while the adult-to-youth category has shrunk, in part because of better hiring practices, better training, that kind of thing. I feel strongly, just sort of instinctually, that this lives downstream of some bigger things that are going on with boys, their attitudes towards guys like Andrew Tate, their shifting attitudes towards feminism, misunderstanding of what feminism is to begin with. Because ultimately, like, this is a form of sexual violence. It's about power, humiliation. And so I just tend to think it lives downstream of that. And so I think, my understanding is that boys who themselves have been bullied are more likely to bully. Boys who feel like they have suffered some type of rejection that they didn't know how to process. And boys who feel like they're falling behind their peers in terms of friendships, romance, that type of thing. Those boys are more vulnerable to kind of fall down this sort of dark rabbit hole online that gives them a very dark, but I think very compelling sales pitch about masculinity. And I think identifying those things I mentioned, like, this boy feels like they're falling behind. This boy is dealing with some kind of rejection. This boy has been bullied. Catching those things and having some awareness that these are the types of things that kind of come before some of this other stuff that's much more dangerous. Catching it then, I tend to think, could be really powerful. And I think there's a big role to play for male teachers, coaches, positive male role models. We have to have an equal and opposite sales pitch here. And I just don't know that we necessarily think of it in those terms.
Evan, when we get to the nuts and bolts for schools, and I know on a podcast like this, I know you could spend a whole day with schools going through what decisions leaders and educators can make and what they need to look out for. And I think we've already learned so much from you in this conversation about what we can be aware of. But I can imagine, as you were speaking about it earlier on, when you were talking about the landscape of deepfakes, I got this sense of feeling overwhelmed. So I can't imagine how school leaders must be feeling in this space as, they talk to someone like you and they're getting all of the stuff that they need to be aware of. These are things that are happening out there. This is how your boys are impacted or engaging in this kind of technology. For those leaders who are super overwhelmed by the speed of this technology and what's happening, what would your advice be for them in terms of an order of operations to ensure that a school is ready, to ensure that a school is resilient, maybe even before the first incident is reported? And probably some of the folk listening to this have already had to deal with this. But in your experience, what would the best practice be in terms of a rollout like that?
It's interesting you mentioned this point, because I got an email this morning from a school that's doing a tabletop with me next week, like a simulation of an incident with their leadership team. And it runs for about 2 hours. It's a pretty full 2 hours. And she highlighted sort of a similar thing. She said, we want to be very mindful about tone here, not to alarm people, but to remind them of their capacity. And I sent her back kind of a think, pair, share style prompt that we're now adding to the beginning of the simulation. And it's basically asking everyone involved, all the leaders, to reflect on another high pressure situation they've had and an asset that they brought to it, whether it was clear communication, empathy for those affected. You can imagine a couple of different answers there. And I stole this concept because it's a pedagogical idea. They've found in research that kids who were asked to reflect on their assets before taking a test performed better. What do you carry with you into this classroom that will help you? Just focusing on that a little bit has been proven to improve results. And so it's funny. I think sometimes when we're teaching adults, we forget that their brains aren't that different. Some of the same kind of ideas that work in the classroom work when training adults. And so I think taking time to reflect on just how much goodwill, how much experience, how much brain power is in some of these rooms, and that schools are not alone. You are not the only school that's going through this, and you are so much better off undertaking this than undergoing it, right? Sort of doing this work before someone with nefarious intent does it to you, and then you're in sort of reaction mode. And with all that kind of comes the fact that best practices are emerging. As more and more schools do this, we're developing what does a best practice look like for policy? I was just at a school last week where they had a massive deepfake sexual abuse scandal or incident. They had 50 victims. And so I sat with them all day long and learned as much as I could about what happened at that school. And I'm now taking a lot of lessons about what goes right, what goes wrong to other schools. And so we're getting better at this, and we're on top of it pretty quickly. This work I'm seeing schools respond really fast. Every day in my inbox, I think I probably have 4 or 5 schools asking to do training like this. That's a bit of a snowball. Schools tend to be big ships that move slowly. And I'm seeing real awareness of this that I did not see even a year ago. In terms of the order of operations, what I tell schools is to start with your leadership team, make them aware of kind of what all those risks are. And then we do activities on drafting policy, getting crisis ready, which is kind of looking at a list of things your community will reasonably expect of you in the first hour, 24 hours, 48 hours of an incident. And then the last activity is about parent engagement. How do we meet parents where they are? What resources do they need? With what tone do we speak with them? What questions might they have? How do we make this a dialogue and a partnership and not a one-way communication? All those types of things. Then I would work with faculty and staff. They don't need to know about the entire risk landscape. And it's not that we're sheltering them. It's that their focus is just a little different. For staff, it's a lot of more cybersecurity focus. And for faculty, it's a lot more, what do you do if a student discloses to you? How do you lead a conversation? We don't want to kind of burden them with certain types of risks that are maybe less in the quadrant of high likelihood, high impact that leadership needs to know about. And then parents and then students in that order. And you can imagine how doing this in a different order would start to kind of turn things upside down. I had a school that wanted to do student training first, and I can understand that. They're the most affected, train them first. I understand the logic. The problem is if you do that and they come home to a parent that knows nothing about this, doesn't know how to support them in the conversation, might even misunderstand and think they've been trained because something happened at the school. That doesn't work. And then teachers won't know, the students got trained and one of them is disclosing for the first time that this actually happened to them, and the teacher doesn't know how to play their role. You educate parents before educating leaders. What if a parent says, what's our policy? What's our plan? The leaders won't have an answer in that moment. So the order really matters. I'm a big, big proponent of leaders, then staff, then parents, then students. I just think it makes the most sense. I understand students are a really high priority. We can move through that order pretty quickly, but I like that order a lot.
Evan, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I have a feeling you might have folk reaching out to you to speak more about this. What I've loved about this conversation is I think I get a real sense that there's hope for schools, that as overwhelming as something like this is, and as out of control or out of a school's control this thing is, and how it can snowball, there are definitely things that schools can do, can be ready for, and can prepare for, so that they can not only deal with whatever issue comes up, but that they can support the boys in their care.
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen in case studies where boys and girls who've been affected by some kind of deepfake incident, deepfake abuse, will go to their teacher, go to their school leaders asking for help, and the school tells them, not our problem. That's happened over and over and over again. So even just doing the bare minimum of showing up for that kid and saying, we are going to help you, that alone makes you in sort of the top 50% of schools. Like, the bar is so low here. But to your point, yeah, I am always the most optimistic person in any room I'm in. And sometimes people ask me, like, this work you do is very dark and you do it every day. How are you doing? Like, are you all right? And I always tell them, like, I'm so optimistic. I get to spend every day working with schools that take this seriously. Like, do you know how encouraging that is? It's great. Like, the alternative is awful. The worst thing we can do is ignore this. That doesn't help anybody. So, I feel very, very optimistic, and I'm so encouraged by what I see from schools right now.
Well, thanks for your optimism, Evan, and thank you for your time and expertise. This has been a fascinating conversation. I know we could probably take a deep dive on each of these topics, but I think as an introduction to folk who are maybe thinking about this or in the first steps of trying to develop policy and what they're doing, I think this has been a really, really helpful conversation. So thank you for being with us and sharing today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you for using your platform to spotlight this. I really appreciate it.
Reflecting on my chat with Evan, what struck me the most was his reminder that just because the image is fake doesn't mean the impact isn't real. It is easy to view deepfakes as a high-tech anomaly, but at its core, this is a human issue involving empathy, power, and the need for trusted adult relationships. Evan's optimism is infectious, and so despite the darkness of this topic, he shows that by being proactive rather than reactive, schools can create a safety net that protects the dignity of every student. I hope today's episode gives you the confidence to start these conversations in your own staff rooms and classrooms. Until our next episode, keep on championing boys' education.